Hi everyone, welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm Lauryn Falcone, a resident at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And tonight we're going to be talking about creating a UWorld journal, specifically for optimizing your studies for step 1 and level 1. And we'll talk a little bit about step 2 as well at the end. While we kind of wait for people to join, I want to just talk for a second about what MST is. So we here at MST are really a community for anyone that needs us through pre-meds all the way to residency. We provide a lot of different services from mentoring and tutoring to different counseling services as well to help applying to medical school or residency. Really any kind of support that you might need, we're here for you and we can provide it for you. With that, let's get started. So some of you have probably heard about a UWorld Journal, maybe others of you haven't. So I want to start by talking about what a UWorld Journal is and what it isn't. So in my years as a tutor, I encouraged every student that I worked with to make a UWorld Journal. Essentially what this is a cumulative, personalized set of notes based on your experience in UWorld. So your UWorld journal might look entirely different than a classmate's UWorld journal. And the point is that the journal is really supposed to be a collection of things that you feel are high yield that you want to remember. Particularly, it should be a collection of things you got wrong, didn't know, or are really concerned and worried that you might forget moving forward. So it's not simply supposed to be a second UWorld, and it's not supposed to be a whole transcription of UWorld. Instead, it's supposed to be a succinct set of notes to help you remember and retain high-yield facts from UWorld. So there's a number of ways that you can do your UWorld journal. Nowadays, I recommend that most of the time students consider an electronic journal. The reason for this is a couple of things. First of all, we all have to get really used to testing online and to studying on the computer. And so if you have your notebook on the computer, you really kind of just start to get used to learning on a screen, studying on a screen. And that's what we have to do on STEP. Our entire test will be electronic. The other reason that an electronic notebook can be really valuable is that it's easy to search. So if you are doing a UWorld question on treatments in diabetes and you get it wrong, you might think, oh, I know I just did a question on insulin regimens in diabetes last week. Well, then you can simply search your notebook and see where you added that high yield fact and expand upon it with this new question. In terms of what medium to use for an electronic journal, it's really up to you. I myself, when I was going through the process for step 2, would just use a Microsoft Word document and keep it really simple and just simply use a bullet point for every new idea. Other students will be even more organized and would like to do a table of contents where they can break up their notebook in Microsoft Word into different sections. Or other students use entirely different medium, like OneNote, for example, where they can have lots of different tabs for different subjects. Now, another option besides doing electronic is some students really feel like they need to write things down and to have a paper version. And so another option is to do your notebook by hand. Now, the advantage of this is that it does give your eyes a break from the computer, and some people do feel like it's easier to study, to carry your notebook with you, to study from paper. So 5 years ago when I took step 1, I actually had a paper notebook. So it is a possibility, although I typically recommend that most students do an electronic notebook just because it's a little bit easier and more efficient. Now again, the point is to create this notebook as you go through UWorld so that you have this awesome resource of high yield facts and things you got wrong to keep studying and ensure that you master this material before the actual exam. Now, having your notebook being organized is really important. But again, organization differs from person to person. So what I find organized, someone else may not find organized. The key is that it has to work for you. It has to be really efficient for you. So if that means keeping it really simple, great. Or if that means having it a pretty complicated organization, that's okay too. Usually for students that want to do a paper journal, I recommend something like a blank 5-subject notebook. This is actually what I used when I was studying for step 1. And you can actually use tabs or sticky notes to break that notebook into different chunks. And on each sticky note, you can write a different subject. So for example, the pink sticky note can be for biochem, the yellow sticky note could be for micro, the blue sticky note could be for neuro and psych. And then as you're going through UWorld, when you get a neuropsych question or an immuno question, you flip to that section of your notebook and you jot your notes down there. This again helps make it more organized so that you are able to kind of quickly jump to a section in your notebook. So all your immunology notes will be in one place so that as you get a new immunology question, it's really easy to put it with the other material related to that. And it's also really easy if you want to just study a certain section of your notebook. Like maybe after your first practice test, you find out that micro is your weakness. Then it would be a good idea to devote even extra time to studying your notebook, particularly the micro section of it. Now, for the electronic notebook, already kind of talked about this a little bit. There are a lot of mediums you could choose to use, whether that be Word, Google Docs, OneNote, Excel. But the idea is that make it you, make it easy and efficient for you. Most students will like to use a table of contents or some sort of way to have tabs, but again, maybe you just want to do a lot of bullet points and that works for you, and you're okay with using the search and find feature in a document. Now, a very common question that students ask me is, what do I put in my notebook? Usually after I have a first session with a student, they'll come back and they'll tell me, oh my gosh, I just feel like there's too much information. I feel like I'm writing too much in my notebook. I don't know what to include. And what I tell every single student and what I recommend to you all is that less is more. Put less in your notebook than you think. You should not be writing big, long paragraphs or complete sentences. Again, the idea is that it's supposed to be brief, high yield, and efficient. So this means abbreviate, use symbols, keep it short and sweet. Only you have to understand this notebook and be able to read it. And we don't want you wasting a lot of time color coding everything and using perfect capitalization and perfect grammar. The point is that it's supposed to be high yield and efficient, and it's not supposed to be a big time sink. So for example, as you're doing UWorld, there's a couple of ways you can make notes in your notebook. You could take a timed or tutor mode block of UWorld questions, and then as you're reviewing each question, think about what you want to put in your notebook. As a general rule of thumb, when students are starting out, I tell them they can put no more than 1 to 2 facts from each UWorld question into their notebook. If a student is struggling and feeling like they're writing too much, usually I say the best place to look, especially starting out, is the educational objective. So the ideal situation is that you review the question completely and entirely in UWorld, and then you open up your notebook and from memory, you type a 1 or 2 sentence summary of the main point and why you got that question wrong into your notebook. Ideally, you should use short phrases, quick facts, lists, bullets, things like that, to kind of get the main point across. Usually I'll tell students, try to minimize putting lots of pictures and tables in your notebook because they tend to take up a lot of space, and before you know it, you'll only be a third of the way done with UWorld and your notebook will be 500 pages long. And when that happens, it's gonna deter you from reviewing the notebook, which is really important. So I usually tell students only once in a rare while, if you think it's an extraordinarily high yield image or table, or better yet, it's an image or table that you've seen many times and you keep getting wrong, then it might be okay to put that in the notebook. Otherwise, summarize what you see in a table, summarize the main point of the question in brief phrase and put it in your notebook. So, an overview, do's and don'ts. As we said, do, keep it brief, keep it high yield. And again, work to commit what you've learned to memory. We'll touch upon this more, but what I mean by this is that it's great to have the notebook, but it's better to actually know the notebook. So a lot of times I'll tell students when you're making your notebook from UWorld, like I said before, don't just have UWorld open and copy what you see on the screen without thinking about it. Read UWorld, understand the explanation. Then, in your own words, make your note in the notebook. That way, you're actively thinking about it and you're committing it to memory. And making that notebook is one extra step of repetition to help you. Don't just blindly copy what you see on UWorld. Along similar lines, make sure that you understand what you're writing down. So if you don't really understand a question or a fact, don't just put it in your notebook. Take a minute and think about it. Put it in words that you do understand. Read the explanation again. And once it gets into your notebook, you should fully understand it. And getting it into your notebook is one extra step to help transcribe it into your mind. And now it will be in your notebook for you to review as much as possible before your test. So again, don't copy whole paragraphs. Don't copy huge tables and images. Ideally, each note in your notebook should be a max of 2 or 3 sentences. And again, don't just make this notebook and then never review it. One of the huge benefits of this notebook is reviewing it a lot, because the idea is that by the time you finish UWorld, you have this awesome high yield resource of facts that you maybe got wrong the first time and you want to now commit to memory. And the best way to do that is lots of repetition. So it'll involve not only making this high yield succinct notebook, but also frequently reviewing it. So here is an example of a question, a simplified version of what you might see in UWorld. So here this question talks about a 67-year-old who presents with chest pain. Page E shows elevations in leads 2, 3, and AVF. The question is, which of the following is the most likely area of damage? And we have a few choices here. Now, the best answer here is the inferior myocardium. Now, let's say that you got this wrong and you weren't really sure what was going on here. This is a perfect example of a question that you want to summarize and put in your notebook. So really, you ask yourself, what was it that I didn't know? And what you didn't know was the fact that leads 2, 3, and AVF correspond to the inferior surface of the heart. So put this in your notebook. Now you have kind of 2 options. One option is that you simply put this fact in your notebook, or another option is that you make your notebook a question and answer style. So you say, what area of the heart is associated with leads 2, 3, and AVF? And then you could answer inferior aspect. So this is just one example of a question and how you might pull the high yield fact from that question. Now here are some additional examples of good notebook notes. One common topic for step 1 is on baroreceptors and whether baroreceptor firing increases or decreases in different scenarios and what effect that has. And so here we see a really good example of a succinct, abbreviated, short, high yield fact. This student was able to summarize an entire UWorld question and distill it down to this short fact. Notice that we're using abbreviations. Notice that we're using arrows to show change. We're not even spelling out full words like increase. We're just abbreviating it INC. And so that's the idea, is that it should be really short, really succinct, high yield. You're going to read this and know what it means, and it's going to help that fact stick in your head without being too wordy. Here's an example of a table. Now again, I generally don't recommend that you use too many tables or figures. However, if it's on a topic that you've missed a lot, it might be worth putting in a quick table. And so here's an example of a table that really gives a lot of information in relatively small amounts of words. And so if you are going to use a table, that is what you should go for. And so here we can talk about different types of jaundice and their bilirubin values with different types of injury. And you can see that you can clearly see quite a few different facts in a few amount of words. Now, here are some examples of bad examples. So I hope that when you look at the screen right away, you kind of cringe and you say, ooh, that looks like a lot. These are just 2 UWorld questions, and they're each a small paragraph. We have thousands of questions in the UWorld Q Bank. If every single notebook note that you made was this size, your UWorld journal would be 500 pages long, and you would never realistically be able to review it. So here in the first example, we see hepatitis A clinical course, talking about a fecal oral transmitted disease in developing countries, what it presents in children and adults like. It also gives us a little bit of a review of immunology, and then it talks about how it's acute, not chronic. There's kind of a lot of facts squeezed into this paragraph. Chances are, maybe you know some of this, and even if you don't, there are definitely ways that we could cut this down to make it more succinct and high yield, which I'll show you next. Another example is biochem. I feel like biochem is an area that students tend to struggle with their notebook because they feel like they just have to put everything and every single step and process into their notebook. Again, keep it short and high yield. So on the next page, we can see examples of how we can chop these way down without losing the high yield effect. So hepatitis A, we can make a notebook note simply listing oral fecal, self-limiting, acute only, often developing countries. And notice we even abbreviated developing there. This gets all the high yield points that were in the last one, but cuts it down to one short phrase. Next, we see carnitine deficiency. Again, we cut it way down to the meat and bones of here's what carnitine deficiency is and some of the symptoms that we see with this disease. So this is really what you're going for. You're distilling an entire UWorld question down to the core of what is the main point and what do I need to remember. I know that it is tempting to include everything. I know that especially in the beginning, you're gonna feel like, I don't know anything. Even all these incorrects, I should make bullet points. I should write down everything. But push yourself to be limited because you will have a lot of UWorld questions, and I promise you that material circles back. So the point, especially in the beginning, is to limit yourself. And if you're not sure how much to write in your notebook, and if you're not sure if you're writing too much, chances are you're writing too much. So limit yourself to only 1 or 2 sentences for each UWorld question about the main point that you want to remember and move on. Now, another question I get asked by students a lot is, when should I review my notebook and how do I review it? The key is that you need to review it fairly frequently. So usually throughout your dedicated, you should be reviewing your notebook at least an hour a week. Typically with the students I work with, we'll try to do anywhere from 2 to 4 hours of notebook review on the day before they take a practice test. So the idea is that the day before they take that test, you're getting a little bit more of an overview of some of the topics in your notebook that you missed. Now, it's kind of your choice in terms of when and how to review this. Some students will tell me, no, you know what? Every night, 30 minutes before bed, I like to read my notebook to kind of wrap up the night. That's great. Other students will say, I love just reading my notebook throughout the day in between UWorld or using other resources to break up the day. That's great as well. You can also definitely focus on weak areas. So for example, if you have a practice test coming up and you feel like pharmacology and neurology are your weaker areas, you could make sure to at least read those sections of your notebook before your test. When you're reviewing your practice test, search your notebook for the answers you got wrong. And often, many students will find that lots of the answers they got wrong on a practice test were actually in their notebook, which means that if you can just commit your notebook to memory, you're going to be getting a lot more questions right. And so usually when I find that that's happening to students, we start to put even more time in their schedule to review the notebook. So I encourage you to do that as well. Use your notebook frequently. Study it a lot, especially before practice tests, and search your notebook when correcting practice tests, and you'll often find some of the facts that you missed were actually in your notebook, and that's just a reminder to keep studying and keep using it. Now, as you get closer to your test, I encourage students to use your notebook even more. Usually, you should try to go through at least 2 full passes of your notebook before you sit for your exam. Sometimes you might want to go through even more than that. Some students will aim for 3 or 4 passes. I know that your notebook will be lengthy and it will be hard to go through, but again, that's why it's important to do it on a regular basis. Don't just make this awesome notebook and decide the day before or 2 days before step that you're going to look at your notebook for the first time. Keep studying it, use it immediately when you start UWorld, use it at the very beginning of your dedicated, and study it regularly throughout your dedicated. And then as you get closer to STEP, I usually encourage students to use it more frequently, especially the last day or two before your exam, as you're kind of winding down on practice questions and doing more broad studying is a great time to get an extra pass of your notebook in. Now, we touched a little bit on when to use your notebook, but we haven't really talked about how. And this is going to be an answer that will vary from person to person because everyone memorizes and studies differently. But for just about every person, the best way to review your notebook is getting it in your head, committing it to memory. And in order to do that, you have to make it a more active process. So you can't just sit there reading all your notes, zoning out, because suddenly you'll realize 20 minutes went by and you didn't actually absorb anything that you were reading. So make it active. A lot of times I'll tell students, if you did it question answer format, cover up the answers and ask yourself the question and answer them as you go. If you didn't, read a fact, and then if you feel like, oh, I didn't really know that fact, or I actually kind of forgot that, highlight it in your notebook or bold it in your notebook. That will make that fact stick out. And the next time you're going through another pass, it'll stand out to you that, oh, this fact I didn't know last time. I need to really make sure I have this committed to memory. When you reach the end of one of the pages in your notebook, look back and summarize what you said. Often I'll tell students, when you finish a page in your notebook, stop, look at a blank wall in front of you, and take a few deep breaths and think about some of the themes you just read. And say, okay, I was just reading about diabetes medications, and I was also reading about thyroid medications and different thyroid disorders and how we treat them. Okay, good. So you knew the high yield points, you got the gist, and you can move on. Now, making a UWorld journal goes hand in hand with using UWorld effectively. So I think we talked a lot about what your UWorld journal should be, what should go into this journal, and how to make it succinct and effective. But it's equally important to make sure that you're using UWorld effectively. I truly believe that the reason most students don't do better on exams and maybe don't do as well on the STEP exams as they want is because they are not using UWorld correctly. So one of the biggest things to remember about UWorld is that it is a learning tool. It is not an assessment tool. So I know it's really tempting to look at your scores and to try to figure out how your scores correlate to a STEP score, looking at your percentiles, getting really amped up if you get a great score or really bummed if you don't. But I encourage all students that I work with not to do this, and I would encourage the same to you. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day if you ace a section or bomb a section. What matters is that you understand the questions, you understand what you got wrong and why, and you learn from it and move on. I have worked with students who have broken 250 on step 1 and scored a 90% on UWorld. And I've also worked with students who broke 250 on step 1 and only scored a 60% on their first pass. So the point is that the score really doesn't matter. What matters is that you use this tool substantially and effectively. Generally, what this means is lots of repetition. And so your notebook is a great way to get this repetition. And another way to get this repetition is to redo your incorrect questions. So generally speaking, most students should aim to complete the UWorld Q Bank as well as their notebook, and then redo any incorrect questions. If you have time, you could consider completing the Q Bank twice. Now again, the point when you're doing your notebook is that you're not writing a text of everything you saw in UWorld. It's supposed to be high yield, succinct, and repetitious. Many students will ask me about flashcards, and I think that flashcards are an excellent learning tool and an excellent way to commit facts to memory. However, your time is very valuable, and you simply don't have time to do everything. So generally, I recommend to students, make your UWorld notebook, study your UWorld notebook, but then also have a pre-made set of flashcards that you can flip through for some facts, even if it's just flashcard decks in some of your weaker areas. Many students will say, well, instead of doing a notebook, can I do flashcards? Can I just make UWorld into flashcards? Now, I worked with one student who did this and broke 250 on STEP. So I'm not going to say it's not possible, but in 5 years of tutoring for STEP, he was the only one that could do it. And I think this is because flashcards, making them by yourself, can be very daunting. And most students have a problem in that they make thousands of flashcards that they can never review. Likewise, a problem with making a flashcard is, let's say you make this really great flashcard on diagnosing hemochromatosis and how hemochromatosis presents. And now, the next week, you get a question on treating hemochromatosis, and you think, oh yeah, I just made that flashcard a week ago on hemochromatosis. Well, unfortunately, it's going to be really difficult for you to go search out and find that flashcard you made. So just having a notebook where all your facts together is much easier to search through and much faster than making your own flashcards. Now again, it's not to say that flashcards can't be done, but if you truly, truly want to make UWorld flashcards instead of a UWorld notebook, be sure that you start early, you keep it really succinct, and you stick with it, and you force yourself to make sure that you're doing the flashcards constantly. Otherwise, do UWorld, make your UWorld notebook, and simply use a pre-made flashcard deck to kind of help solidify information. Now, for step 2, you can really do the exact same thing. Use the same approach and make a step 2 UWorld journal. The difference with step 2 is that for most students, you really don't need to study as long because your clinical courses really prepare you well for this exam, as do your clinical shelf exams. So you generally just need to aim to complete UWorld one time and then create your journal as you're doing UWorld. Now, I always recommend to students that, with step 2, we often start UWorld much earlier, and we do UWorld along with our clinical courses. So just like with step 1, whenever you start UWorld, you have to start your UWorld notebook. So if you're planning on doing a full pass of UWorld and taking step 2 right at the end of your clinical year, then you need to start your UWorld journal at the beginning of your year when you start UWorld, and go through UWorld throughout the year and also make your journal throughout the year. That way at the end of the year, you have this awesome high yield journal that you can keep studying, and you've also gone through your pass of UWorld. Just for a quick review, we will touch on primary resources for step 1. Of course, First Aid and UWorld are quintessential. We talked a lot about UWorld. Students will often ask me, should I pull other resources into my UWorld journal? Should I pull facts from First Aid, facts from Sketchy, and things like that? And I generally say no, because it's going to be too much material. And at some point, you have to draw the line and tell yourself enough is enough. And UWorld really is the gold standard resource. And so just make your journal UWorld and use these other resources for reference. And here are some other resources that are really great. Pathoma is another really excellent resource for pathology, as well as some of the Sketchy resources. So point of First Aid is to be really just a concise outline. It's a great reference tool. Usually I'll tell students use First Aid with your coursework and then reference it during your dedicated. UWorld is really the meat and bones of step 1 material. It really has all the high yield facts with very detailed information to help you learn to conquer this test. And so this really should be your main resource. The overwhelming majority of your time should be spent on UWorld. If you're short on time or you're not progressing through material, cut out other resources and focus on UWorld, doing lots of questions, making your notebook, repetition, repetition, repetition. Then as you get in a better rhythm, you can start to add other resources on. And so that's kind of where we get to layering resources. First Aid is a really great intro resource, a really great resource, especially to get scope and to use alongside your coursework. UWorld is the main core resource that we want to be using. This is the resource where we're really going to learn to conquer the test and learn to get the most important information. And then everything else is really supplemental. Pathoma is fantastic, and I encourage all students to try to do 1 or 2 resources. And then other things like Boards and Beyond and Sketchies can be great as well. But again, we really can only add on these resources once we're progressing through UWorld at an appropriate pace. So focus on UWorld and add in other things as you can. Now, another important point, and something that I touched on earlier, is that it's okay to not know everything in UWorld right away. Usually, every student, when starting UWorld, feels overwhelmed. You'll read the explanation, you'll think, oh my gosh, I feel like I don't know any of this. And that doesn't mean that you should get overwhelmed and put it all in your notebook. It doesn't mean I need to stop doing UWorld and I need to go read for days on this topic before I come back and lots of other resources. No. Even if you are getting 20s and 30% on UWorld when you stop, it doesn't mean put UWorld down. It means you need to do UWorld more. Keep doing questions, hound that material, use UWorld, and don't just go to other resources because you think you're not ready. UWorld is the resource that we must use, and this needs to be our first resource. When you're making your notebook, even if you feel like you don't know anything, summarize the high yield fact, summarize the main point, and put it in your question. As you do more and more questions, you'll notice that material cycles around. You get material on the similar topics all the time, and your knowledge base will start to grow if you stick with UWorld. So don't just give up on UWorld and use other resources because you're feeling overwhelmed, or don't just start copying everything from UWorld into your notebook because you feel like you don't know everything. Focus on UWorld, focus on high yield, succinct facts, and only add in other resources once you feel like you have a good handle on UWorld and you're progressing at a good pace through UWorld. Now with that, I want to just take a second to talk about MST. You've kind of heard me talking a little bit about it tonight. And again, we are a team that is really here for any of your needs, whether it be pre-med through residency. We have expert tutors that can help you design a schedule, review content, or just be a mentor. I think with a lot of students that I've worked with, what they've really appreciated is having someone that they can constantly talk to, constantly run questions by, and help them really triage material or overcome roadblocks as they come up. So we're a great resource, and definitely I encourage all of you to reach out if there's anything we can help with or any guidance you might want. And with that, we're going to switch over to any questions that you guys have. Someone asked about the ideal way to do UWorld and whether it's better to do timed or tutor. That's a great question, but it's a little bit of a complicated one, and it actually varies from student to student. In general, I would say that do what's right for you and do a mix. There really isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way with taking UWorld. It really is whatever way is going to get you using UWorld frequently and keep your attention. So if you're the type of person who you feel like it's hard to get through a day of studying and you tend to get bored, break it up. Do a timed UWorld question and review it. And then do 10 tutor mode questions and review them as you go. And then take 30 minutes to review your notebook. And then go back and do 10 more tutor mode questions. So you really can kind of break it up and use it in a way that works for you, whether that be timed or tutor mode. Now, if you feel like you are struggling with timed conditions, and I've had some students who really struggle to finish blocks on practice tests, we will actually do more timed UWorld blocks to simulate testing conditions. So that is something to kind of keep in mind if you struggle with that, or if you feel like you tend to do worse under timed conditions. In terms of the ideal number of blocks to do per day, that is a little bit tricky as well, because it also depends on a lot of factors. Primarily, how long do you get through UWorld? How long do you have? Again, you have to finish UWorld before your step one. Absolutely must finish it at least once. So if you have 30 days to study, then simply divide the number of questions in UWorld by 30, and that's the number of questions you have to aim to do per day. For most students, that comes out to being about 80 questions per day. The majority of students can take and review 80 questions a day and still have 2 to 3 hours to review other resources. The max that a student should really do in a day, and this would be when you're towards the end of UWorld and feeling really comfortable with the material, is 100. If you're doing more than 80 to 100 questions a day, you're going too fast. you're just whipping through UWorld and you're not giving yourself time to understand and properly review. Again, the goal is not to just finish UWorld. It's to take each question, review it, understand it, make that high yield, succinct fact in your notebook from memory, and move on. Someone else asked about MBMEs, and yes, I absolutely recommend doing MBMEs. For most students, I recommend doing at least 3 MBMEs before your test to fully simulate testing conditions and make sure that your score trajectory is heading in the direction you want. But that can vary from student to student as well. But yes, definitely take MBMEs and definitely review them, but you don't necessarily need to worry about putting notes from the MBMEs into your UWorld journal. Someone else made a great comment about feeling like they just started doing UWorld and worrying that they're going to miss facts in their notebook. And again, I want to reassure you that UWorld comes around. There's a huge cycling of material. So it is absolutely normal to feel overwhelmed in the beginning and to really worry that you're missing putting important information in your notebook. And when you're just starting out, it is hard to know what's important. And so that's why I tell students, especially when starting out, if you're not sure, then what you should put in your notebook should essentially be a succinct, personal summary of the educational objective, and that's it. Someone else mentioned a question about annotating in First Aid versus UWorld Journal. This is another great question, and I'm glad you brought this up because I didn't mention it, but it is a question a lot of students will ask. And I generally tell students, you can't do everything. And we hit on this when we talked about making your own flashcards. If you try to do too many things, you're going to spread yourself too thin, and you're not going to get to a thorough review of everything. So it's much better to focus in on 1 or 2 things. So focus on doing UWorld and focus on making a journal. Generally, that means not annotating First Aid. And generally, it means just referencing First Aid as you go along and in your coursework. You really don't want to be making a UWorld journal and making notes in First Aid, because then suddenly you have notes in 2 places and it's really confusing, and you find that all you're doing is just writing notes and you're never having time to review it. And then you can't remember, did I write that note in First Aid or did I write that note in my notebook? So really, ideally, you should keep it all in your notebook. The problem with annotating First Aid is that there's really not much room there to annotate, and then you often will find yourself rewriting things that are already in the text, and it's just not as efficient. So I generally recommend sticking to the UWorld journal. And with that, we'll wrap up. I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope that you all have a great night and that this was helpful to you all. Bye-bye.